Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Facebook Live on One Page. Today is a very special day where we're going to have a panel discussing what's really important that's happening around the world. First thing first, I hope everyone is safe and healthy and taking care of each other while we try to deal with this pandemic and learning about COVID-19. And one of the things that's so important is that we share each other's stories so we can grow together and learn from each other. I'm Sangita Patel. I'm in Canada. I'm one of the Canadian ambassadors for ONE, and welcome to my home. My kids are somewhere in the house. I'm not sure where they are, but that's the feeling that everyone is having right now, being in isolation. So from my home to your home, so wonderful to connect with you in a way that's so important. And today is going to be a discussion that's going to be something that's going to be uplifting, as well an idea of what's going on in the world. So today we are going to be focusing on what's happening in Africa and our contribution as Canadians in helping global solutions for this crisis. And I'd like to introduce you to our panel, absolutely amazing panel that we're going to be having a discussion today. Canada's Minister of International Development, the Honorable Karina Gould. Hello, it's good to see you. Nice to connect with you. ONE's Nigeria Director, Serah Ugbabe. There she is. And award-winning investigative journalist in West Africa, Peter Nkanga. So wonderful to have you all right now and to connect this way. So it's interesting times where we do really need to have a discussion of what's going on around the world. And right now we're connecting with the world through social media and being able to talk about our stories. So Serah, first thing first, can you explain a little bit of what ONE is doing and their new campaign, One World?
Thank you, Sangita. First of all, I want to just congratulate and thank the Honourable Minister for Canada's pledge for Gavi. We know Canada gave us $600 million, and that's really important even at a time like this with a pandemic raging. And Canada has been supporting Gavi from the beginning. So I just want to start by saying thank you. That matters, and we really appreciate that. Back to your question, Sangita, on what ONE is doing. So ONE is an advocacy and campaigning organization, and our mission is to end extreme poverty and preventable diseases. So the population that we're trying to support is actually affected. All of us are affected. So we decided to develop a campaign called One World. Effectively, we're saying a global pandemic requires a global response. So all countries need to stand together because in truth, none of us are safe until all of us are safe. And this is the time that, with solidarity, we can ensure that those who are economically hardest hit are have a bit more support. We can ensure that we shore up our health system. So if this happens again, we're better prepared to address it. And we should ensure that when the vaccines are created, because that's our exit strategy, they're distributed and affordable and available for everyone, including those on the continent. So that's kind of what we've been doing in One World. The role of government is apparent. The role of private sector is apparent. Citizens' voices are so important, and that's a message that we want to make sure folks don't feel like they can't do anything. They can, and their voices matter at a time like this.
Especially at a time like this. Thank you, Serah. And to the Minister and Peter, I don't even know how to ask this question anymore. Like, how are you doing? How are you coping? It's a different way of answering that question. But the Minister, this must be a very unique time, an unprecedented time. So how are you coping as a mom first? And second, as a minister?
Well, thank you, Sangita. And thank you, Serah, for mentioning Canada's contribution to Gavi. I was really proud to announce Canada's $600 million contribution to Gavi and $190 million to polio. One important thing to note in this is that what we've learned from past epidemics is that we can't ignore other pressing health issues, and routine immunization is going to make sure that we don't have an even bigger health crisis on the horizon. As a mom, I guess you can probably hear my son crying upstairs now, so that's timing. But my husband has really stepped up and just been doing yeoman's work in terms of childcare. But anyways, it's certainly a challenge, and so I can empathize and sympathize with parents here in Canada and around the world who are trying to work from home, but also looking after their little ones. So
I feel Oliver right now. I feel him right now.
I'm surprised because Dora's supposed to be on right now. So normally that is like full attention. So I'm not sure what happened, but I know that my husband is on it. So as a mom, I'm trying to balance everything, which I know so many other parents are doing as well. As a minister, you're right. This is a totally unprecedented time. I was so honored when the Prime Minister named me Minister of International Development because, working to support the poorest and the most vulnerable is absolutely my passion. And so I was just so excited to get this portfolio. But of course, like anyone else, I didn't imagine taking it on during the time of a global pandemic. And this is truly a unique moment in recent history because, as Sarah mentioned, this is happening everywhere in the world and simultaneously. And so our normal way of doing business, of sending humanitarians abroad to the scene of the disaster or of the crisis is just not possible right now. And so we have to think about different ways of working. And for me, what that really means is, what are we doing to support local actors on the ground to facilitate knowledge transfer and to make sure that Canada is doing its part? Because as Sarah said, and as the World Health Organization said, as our Prime Minister has said, no one in the world is safe until everyone in the world is safe. And so Canada has been very proud to contribute an additional $159.5 million for our immediate response for the humanitarian crisis to CEPI, so that we can develop a vaccine, and that when it is available, it's going to be accessible and affordable for everyone on the planet. And so really making sure that we have a global response to this global crisis is really important. And I've been really proud that here in Canada, our domestic response has included a global response, because we understand that we are all part of this and we have to find the solutions together.
And Peter, as a journalist, being in Africa and seeing the changes that are in place right now during this pandemic, how has it been for you to be out there?
Sangita, I'll tell you the truth, it's been tough. It's a realization of how frail humanity is. It's a realization that it actually has led to a lot of introspection. And it has been a sort of mixed blessings, if you ask me, because while it is making people aware that Africa is a focal point now in a global pandemic, it's also making people aware that you have to invest in yourself. And so when people come out to say they want to support you investing in yourself, like Canada is doing, it gives a lot of introspection on how do we ensure that such a situation doesn't happen. But I can tell you it's been very devastating, and the evidence abounds, and I'm sure in the course of the discussion, we will highlight the evidence that abound in what everybody is feeling at the same time. Misery, but there's still hope.
Yeah. And Sarah, it's one of the things that we see all the time. We're talking about North America, we're talking about Europe, we're talking about China and the effects of places that have been hit the hardest. And when we talk about Africa, you don't really hear much about how this pandemic has really affecting Africa. So how is it there? And is there anything in place in case there is a surge of pandemic of the COVID affecting Africa?
Yeah, it's hit us hard, like it's hit other areas. Right now, I think the statistics are over 75,000 people have been infected. About 3,000 people have died as a result. And if you look at a lot of economies, where they were 3 months ago is not where they are today. So this is where we are today. We're not sure what it looks like in 2 months or 3 months. But that notwithstanding, I think there's an imminent economic output that is coming out that is impacting the health crisis. Mm-hmm. So folks look at our numbers on the continent and say, well, it doesn't look like what's happening in North America. It doesn't look like what's happening in Europe. But the truth is, economically, it's devastating. So what has happened in the last few days, I'll walk through what the lay of the land has been. The first thing is that we've seen a lot of African countries come out in solidarity. We've seen leaders step up and say, none of us are safe until all of us are safe. So frankly, as a national response, I can't have a national response as Nigeria or Sudan or Kenya. We need to act as Pan-Africans. So we've seen that solidarity, and that's really heartening. I think it's worth noticing. We've also seen our leaders have responded from a variety of ways of sort of defensiveness sometimes to a more technical approach. But we've seen Africans call for partnership because they're saying we don't have all the answers, and there are answers out there. So they're calling for citizens to partner, private sectors to partner, civil society to partner. The other thing we've seen is the private sector is stepping up. So the world's just the world's most wealthy philanthropist, Aliko Dangote, through his foundation, is giving quite a bit to Nigeria. We see Strive Masiyiwa, a Zimbabwean philanthropist, supporting the AU so they can purchase reagents and masks and gloves as bulk, as a unit. So we're seeing the private sector, banks are stepping up, doing what they can, creating isolation beds, so that's been really heartening. But Africa went through lockdowns, actually very aggressively in the beginning, and that has an economic impact on population. Nigeria, for instance, has 200 million. 50%, at least 50%, 100 million need to go out every single day, eat. So what a lockdown does is you can't go out every single day. Down. So that impact has been massive. We're seeing that a lot of countries, lockdowns were things we couldn't afford long term. So a lot of countries have relaxed that to curfews, no more sort of gathering at churches and mosques. But we're seeing that economic toll this is having we're going to feel those repercussions for years to come. So vulnerable populations are even becoming more fragile. As Peter says, the frailty of humanity is being exposed. So what's happening is African countries are grappling with the revenues are going down, commodity prices are going down. So we're seeing all of that, but yet they must pull from their coffers to give to the vulnerable populations. So people during the lockdown had free food. At least for Nigeria, 3.6 million people were in a register to receive free food out of 200 million people, and out of a 50+% of people living under $1 a day. So we see that pressure from governments to balance this need to support lives and livelihoods with a health issue, with an economic issue, and that's not been easy. If we look into our health systems, they were already fragile to start with. And we have been here before with Ebola on the continent, so we've seen how to prepare for epidemics and pandemics of this nature, but not in the scale. So while that has helped somewhat, the need is still significant. And every African country is not set up the same. So what might be happening in Mali is not the same in South Africa. It's not monolithic. And sometimes from the West, when we talk about Africa, it's this one big, massive sort of blob of a country, and that's not the case. There's such diversity of language, ethnicities, economic regimes. So there's sophistication in how to deal with different African countries. Mali has one ventilator for 1 million. The UK has one ventilator for 8,000 people. So we see how we're starting with the health impact. Hunger is going to be on the rise. Stories of people just getting WhatsApp messages saying, my plumber is asking me for funds. He has 4 kids, 5 kids, can't feed them, can't go out to work as a plumber. Can you give resources to them? So this is kind of what's happening. Scientifically, we see Senegal with the dollar test. So we know that Africa is now left out of the conversation when it comes to the science and how to address this. Innovations that we used during the Ebola are coming up now. So there's a mixed bag, but the truth and the point is that it's affecting us. It's a double whammy of a health crisis and economic crisis. In some ways, it's a triple whammy, because with the economic crisis and the food crisis, then there's a security crisis that might bubble up. So we're really trying to, again, band together in solidarity to address these things on the continent.
That's a lot to take in. Global activists are volunteers on the ONE campaign to help end extreme poverty and preventable diseases. So volunteers have asked some questions. Minister, the first question is from Amarachi, a ONE champion in Nigeria.
Hello. My name is Amarachi. I'm a 2019 ONE champion, a public health specialist from Nigeria. On a personal level, I've been involved in a series of public health education and awareness creation, especially in dispelling the misconceptions, the myths, and the propaganda surrounding the coronavirus outbreak. In Canada, what is the general reaction of the people towards some of these propagandas flying around, and how has this affected their health behavior in implementing the guidelines set up by the government to mitigate the spread of the virus? Thank you.
So, Minister, how would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, great. Well, Amarachi, thank you so much for your question and also for all of your work in public health and as an activist for the ONE campaign. I think that, you know, the issue of misinformation and disinformation is huge all around the world. And actually, before I was the Minister of International Development, I was the Minister of Democratic Institutions. And so this is an issue that's particularly close to my heart. I would say that here in Canada, I think people have been really good and really responsible in terms of how they're responding to the crisis. Of course, you know, there is misinformation that's spreading, and the government, you know, is trying to, as best as they can, identify those myths. So, for example, you know, there was something that was going around, you know, suggesting that people wash their hands with bleach, right? That's a terrible idea to do. And so, you know, trying to address those issues head on. And we have, you know, every day our Prime Minister, our Minister of Health, and Dr. Theresa Tam, our Chief Medical Officer of Public Health, do a press conference to provide the latest information to Canadians. And we're trying to be as transparent as possible with the information that we have with regards to the virus, but also with regards to the trends and the modeling, and working together with different levels of government to provide that information. In terms of what the Government of Canada is doing internationally, we have long-term had relationships with two organizations, the Journalists for Human Rights and Farm Radio International, which work to build capacity for journalists all around the world. But for Farm Radio International, they provide you know, information through radio in a multiplicity of different languages across the African continent. And both of these organizations have pivoted their work to make sure that they're providing accurate information in local languages right across Africa. And this is something that, you know, I'm very interested in and working on. I know that the WHO is putting out lots of really good information, and they even have a WhatsApp group that sends the latest information that people can log on to, which I think is a really great initiative. And so this is something that we continue to look into, but, you know, it's people like you who are on the front lines providing that information and making sure that you know, everyone in your country, in your community, has access to the best information. And I'm sure Peter probably has something to say on this, but we certainly learned from our experience responding to the Ebola crises, both in West Africa, but also more recently in the Democratic Republic of Congo, how important it is to have local leaders, local voices who are providing public health information because they're trusted sources in their communities.
Now, earlier, Minister Sarah touched the base on the hunger crisis that's happening in Africa, and you've been involved with meetings for food security and nutrition, and Canada supports a World Food Program. When you hear what is happening, she called it a triple whammy right now, what's happening in all of Africa. So how would you respond to that, and how can Canada really help?
Yeah, I mean, this is actually what keeps me up most at night. I mean, obviously, the immediate COVID health crisis and emergency is a top priority in terms of our response. And I think Sarah did a good job of, you know, explaining that kind of the different capacities and capabilities of different countries in Africa to respond. But it's the food security crisis looming on the horizon that's the one that's most worrisome for me. David Beasley, the head of the World Food Program, in his address to the United Nations Security Council, talked of multiple famines of biblical proportions. What the international community is estimating right now is a doubling of people who are in acute food need, and a doubling of people who are going into extreme poverty. And it's precisely because of what Sarah was talking about, of, you know, day laborers who depend on those daily wages to provide food for their families. They're already in vulnerable, precarious situations. And now not being able to go to work, not being able to earn that income has pushed them, has marginalized them even further. So Canada, in our initial response to the UN appeal, provided $13.5 million to the World Food Program. We've provided some supports to the Food and Agricultural Organization and other institutions that are working in delivering immediate humanitarian assistance. And I, as you mentioned, participated in and co-hosted actually with Italy, a high-level political forum at the United Nations on food security to raise this issue. And, it's about providing resources to humanitarian organizations to make sure that they can get food to those who are most vulnerable. It's also about making sure that we're getting agricultural inputs to farmers so that they don't miss this planting season. And also is happening in Africa right now, in East Africa, is the locust crisis, which is having a significant impact on the potential yields for the planting season. And so we need to make sure that we're getting food to those who are at risk of a nutrition and a food security crisis. But we also need to make sure that we're supporting our small share agriculturalists so that they can take advantage of this planting season. And so to do that, Canada is also raising in the WTO and in multilateral forums, in the G7 and the G20 with some of my colleagues and myself, and really encouraging countries not to put protectionist measures in place to make sure that we continue moving supply chains, particularly in food, particularly in agriculture, but also with regards to medicine and medical supplies, so that we can continue to make sure that everyone's getting the supplies and the resources that they need, and that we can avoid what could be a very devastating humanitarian crisis on the future. And so personally, I've been really involved in this because that's, as I said, that's what keeps me up at night is, the kind of the collateral damage of our public health response to COVID. And so we really, really need to avoid this. And that's why Canada has been on the forefront of the issue of food security these past couple of months. And we're looking at ways that we can continue to support and ensure that people get the support, the food, and the nutritional inputs that they need.
Peter, have you seen this firsthand? Have you seen a shift as we're dealing with this pandemic in Africa? I mean, we've always dealt with it. We know there's extreme poverty in Africa, but have you seen the change that's happened in the last 2 months?
Yes, thank you. I think, there are many issues that have arisen because of COVID-19. And Africa is peculiar, but like the experts say, is the next frontier. Is the next frontier. We might right now be having the least number of confirmed cases in the world when you compare it to other regions. But we have a population of 1.2 billion. And that means, should it spread, we are at grave risk. And like one and the Honorable Minister rightly said, we have a crisis at hand. And what is that crisis? Many issues have arisen because of this, and this is affecting countries across the whole continent. And not even one country is now free. Every country is now infected. The last two countries were Lesotho and Comoros Island. But now what we are seeing now, what is happening is because of measures taken, we are seeing different reactions. And action must bring a reaction. We're talking about border closures. As a result of that, what we are seeing is that there are now cases of smuggling, right? Black markets. We're talking about when you are enforcing lockdowns and you don't take into account the peculiarities of different communities, different countries. I like what the minister said because she mentioned DRC Congo. We're talking about things where there are underlying issues. We already have crises like in DRC where you have Ebola that is still ravaging. How do you deal with two crises at the same time? We're talking about in Nigeria, we have Lassa fever that is still ongoing, ravaging. We have so many issues. And then we're talking about the economics in terms of health, security, finance concerns. We're talking about how do you get funds, dwindling funds, no local testing, economic strain. So many issues. And what we see as a result of that is how there has been a rise of violence in times of lockdowns. Well, that's why you are seeing a lot of easing of the lockdowns. And as a result of that, what are we also seeing? We're also seeing governments taking up actions, the executive orders. We are seeing bills trying to be passed in parliament. We are seeing laws of countries. We are seeing states of emergency across the continent. And as a result of that, there are a lot of conspiracies. We talked about misinformation. There are a lot of conspiracies in the air. And when you have lost so much of trust in your government, you need hope for people to believe that what you're doing is actually in the best interest of the people. Right now, what we see across the continent is citizens are even doubtful whether there's actually anything like COVID-19. Well, citizens even say whether it's just a ploy for foreign donors to continue to have funding in Africa. Well, people denouncing it and saying it's not true. Well, conspiracies, and that's part of the misinformation. But just to say one thing that I believe that there's still hope, because at the end of the day, we're talking about community messaging, which is what we are trying to bring it down to. At the end of the day, the elites could be in the urban areas and know how to isolate, but those in the rural and those in the densely populated areas, isolation doesn't mean the same thing. And that is where the cause is. We have to adapt to ways that we could learn from the experience of Ebola. One of the things that we learn from Ebola is when you say social distancing, it will not work. Why it will not work? Because people have to earn a daily wage in communities in Africa, unlike other places. As a result, there should be ways that you empower the communities who are going to be following on policies by governments to do what is necessary so that everybody's on the same plane, not some people believing, some people drifting astray, taking this. So if I should just say in a nutshell, that it's about knowing the peculiarities of each state, each country in the continent, but also forging a global partnership that can ensure that as each person is helping himself, he can also help the next person, the next country.
I love the way, so it's about hope too. If you're just joining us, we have a great panel here with us. I'm joined by Canada's International Development Minister, Karina Gould, Serah Ugbabe, and Nigeria Director of the ONE campaign, and African Journalist Peter Nkanga. The next question for you, Minister, you talked about a little bit about the vaccination and having access to it, and also polio eradication. Our next question is from Natalie, who's a ONE volunteer from Quebec. She is speaking in French. We do have the subtitles at the bottom, related to vaccines and treatment for COVID-19.
Bonjour, ici Nathalie Lemay de Saint-Basile-le-Grand dans la circonscription de Montarville. Dans la lutte contre le VIH-Sida, on a réussi à sauver plusieurs vies en rendant abordables les antirétroviraux et ça en diminuant leur prix de façon considérable. Ma question est la suivante. En plus d'un soutien financier annoncé par le Canada pour la mise au point d'un nouveau vaccin de la COVID-19, est-ce que des actions concrètes seront mises de l'avant de la part du gouvernement du Canada pour s'assurer que le vaccin sera produit rapidement, en grande quantité, mais surtout avec un minimum de profit. Tout ça dans le but de le rendre accessible à tous, partout dans le monde, à un coût raisonnable.
Well, Minister, what are we doing to make sure it is affordable?
OK, bon, merci beaucoup, Nathalie, pour la question. C'est une excellente question. So thank you, Natalie, for the question. It's an excellent question, and this is something that's at the heart of Canada's response. So I mentioned earlier that we've contributed to CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation. We've made an initial contribution of $40 million, and one of their objectives is precisely this, is to coordinate the development of vaccines, but also to make sure that once a vaccine is available, that it is accessible and affordable around the world. So we're very happy to be part of CEPI. And CEPI came out of the Ebola crisis in West Africa to make sure that there was a global response. You probably also saw on May 4th, our Prime Minister participated with the European Union in the accelerator for the coronavirus treatment, and encouraged other countries to participate as well. The Prime Minister also committed that Canada would be a strong champion to ensure that once a vaccine is developed, that we're sharing that information around the world, and that we're working collaboratively to ensure that it is as accessible and affordable as possible. And Canada is also engaging in important diplomatic efforts at the World Health Organization. So, for example, at the upcoming World Health Assembly, we are doing our part to try to get consensus on making sure that that this is a global good when a vaccine is developed, and that we are dispersing manufacturing abilities around the world, and importantly, that we're including voices and researchers from the global south. I think it was Sarah who mentioned earlier, the work that's going on in Senegal, but we know that there's important, laboratories across the African continent that, need to be engaged in this, and a lot of important researchers from Africa that we need to be engaging. And I think the point that both Sarah and Peter made is that, all of our responses, we don't have a one-size-fits-all response. We have to make make sure that we're looking at the unique context of every country, particularly when it comes to distribution, but making sure that, on the front lines, we are including healthcare workers from around the world in terms of being first able to get access to the vaccine, but also making sure that developing countries are at the front of the line as well, because we also know that in a lot of developing countries that a vaccine and treatment is going to be really important because they don't necessarily have the same kind of healthcare services and supports that we enjoy here in Canada. And so making sure that they have access to a vaccine is going to be really, really important. And that's something that, personally I'm committed to. The Prime Minister has come out very strongly for, and we're encouraging other world leaders and countries and pharmaceutical companies to join us to make sure that this vaccine, when it is developed, is available, accessible, and affordable to all.
Sangita, can I highlight two things that the Honourable Minister mentioned? The first, and sometimes these conversations are technical. The first thing she mentioned is sort of the global public good. Just because a vaccine exists does not mean it gets to you, because the distribution process, the development process. So having attention to the production and distribution process is really important. The second thing she mentioned is ensuring that we have African researchers and scientists in the mix, so that that solution is co-created with African scientists who have been on the forefront of creating Ebola vaccines that we're seeing being developed. So those 2 points, I think it's important for our viewers to understand that the attention to vaccines is important, and ensuring that it's a global public good is very important.
Well said. That's a really good point. And, it's a time that we really praise scientists for stepping up and coming together. You're making a really good point about the world coming together and trying to find this solution, which is so important. Another issue that's been coming up a lot, and it's going to be an intro to our next video, is gender equality. Now, 2 years ago, I went to Africa and to kind of meet with the whole campaign that ONE was working on, and that's poverty is sexist. And so the fact that we need to acknowledge this at a time like this. So this is a very good question. Minister, this is going to you first.
Hi, my name is Sani. I'm a sexual and reproductive health and rights worker in Nigeria. Work is really busy right now, as I've been providing information and services to victims and survivors of sexual and gender-based violence. I'm interested to know how Canada's Feminist International Assistance Policy is affecting its global response to COVID-19. Thank you.
Great. Well, Sani, thank you so much for that question and for the incredibly important work that you're doing. Our Feminist International Assistance Policy is guiding our response to COVID-19. One of the areas that I think is most worrisome is that as countries go into lockdowns or take isolation procedures, we know that people have to stay confined within their own homes. And for people, whether they're here in Canada or in Africa or anywhere in the world, if you're already living in a situation that is dangerous or with an abuser, whether you're a woman or a child, that this confinement can be even worse. And so the Secretary General's initial call almost 6 weeks ago for governments to take the issue of sexual and gender-based violence seriously and to make sure that they're providing adequate protection services is so unbelievably important, and something that Canada has been advocating for, and we're fully supportive of the Secretary General's call. We're also working with our partners, for example, with UNFPA and UN Women and UNICEF on making sure that protection services are available for children. For kids, again, who may be living in an abusive situation, they don't even have the escape of going to school right now with 1.5 billion children who are out of school. And so making sure that we have those supports in place is really important. And then with regards to sexual rights and reproductive health, this is an area where Canada has been leading, and I think we are actually now the top donor in the world on SRHR. But we also recognize that we need to, as much as possible, keep these services going so that we can protect women and children's health throughout this pandemic. And so again, working with partners like UNFPA, doing our best to make sure that they have the necessary PPE, the necessary training, to keep working with women to provide these really crucial services for their health. So these are top concerns, and we're continuing to engage with different partners. I've had calls with, oh my gosh, I think almost every head of every UN agency over the past number of weeks, and I've reiterated the importance of taking a gender analysis to this response, making sure that we're not leaving women and girls and children behind, understanding that there is a gender dimension. And Canada also led on a resolution or a statement with 58 other countries to make sure that SRHR is part of our response. Because again, we need to learn the lessons from past crises. We saw in the West Africa Ebola crisis, a spike in newborn and maternal deaths because there was a pivot to the Ebola response, and we left behind some of the really crucial health interventions. And so from Canada's perspective, we're encouraging other partner countries, other international organizations to, as much as possible, continue with those really important life-saving interventions. So thanks for raising this issue, and thanks for the work that you're doing, because we have to recognize the gender dimensions of this crisis.
And so, Sarah, I'm going to throw this back to you. Was this one of your big worries once we were getting into this whole isolation situation, and the minister touched on it about the idea of more women are being abused, kids are, isolated at home, they don't have the relief of going to a school? Was that a concern for you?
Yes, and knowing that 89% of women in the working are in the informal economy, so 80% of women in Africa in the formal economy. So with the lockdowns, that economic burden increases. We also saw that not just the economic burden increasing for women in the informal sector, the domestic home care responsibilities increased. I mean, we had a conversation here with everyone sort of being stretched, kids are at home. We know the realities of that, and those are being felt by people all over the continent. In fact, I have a mentee that works with me. Once the lockdown was imposed, she called me. She's 33, has 4 kids. Her husband is a fuel attendant, and he wasn't getting as much commissions. She couldn't go out to work, and she needed to fend for her 4 kids with the amount she was getting in. So it was a moment of sort of community rallying across to get to her. And we're also seeing, for instance, in Nigeria, the Minister of Health just responded yesterday by saying we had a 50% lower attendance for antenatal, for immunizations in the last 3 months. So as the Honorable Minister mentioned, during Ebola, other diseases were being left behind. We really have to pay a lot of attention, because these diseases that impact our maternal mortality rate, which really is the place where you can tell if a healthcare system is healthy or not, or in mortality rates, whatever impacts those 2 ratios are very important for the entire healthcare. And we're seeing, even with this lockdown and the COVID pandemic, that attention still needs to be placed on these issues. We're also seeing the domestic violence increase. I'm really grateful for the work that Sani is doing through his organization, Bridge Connect Africa in Kano State, because he set up a hotline. Him and the team have set up a hotline so they can start getting resources to people who need it at a time like this. Truly, we need to come together, because the pandemic is a mirror that's showing us all the other sort of holes we have, and it'll take all of us to plug those holes.
Yeah.
Peter, do you want to add?
Yeah, I want to add, because it's actually a subject that needs to be reinforced. The issue of gender-based violence during this pandemic of COVID-19 is a global issue, but Africa has its peculiarities. And the peculiarities are because we have I have to say the truth, very dismal medical health care system. We have less protective laws for women across countries in Africa, but we have fewer resources and the means to access the resources. So what we're seeing is that people are trapped in abuse and they have limited options or choices. So every support we can to know that there are people who are suffering even beyond the general suffering, that are suffering internally, externally, that it should be reinforced. And I think one of the things we can do is we can take a cue from countries and what is happening across the world. For example, in Spain and in some countries in Europe, where women especially who have been abused, when they go to the pharmacy, they have developed a code for the pharmacist to know that, oh, something is going on in my home, and that person can now be the one that will send the signal to the correct authorities. And it has been proven that if we don't take action on gender-based violence during this pandemic that we know is going to be with us for a while, that we're going to see more crimes. That's why even South Africa had to ban sale of alcohol and cigarette, because they said they did that research. They said it's associated with violence. So there are issues that we need to look in, and I'm happy that the Canadian minister is here to see that this is an aspect that she's taking very, very deeply, and the support is will be very large for her, especially on GBV issues during this pandemic.
Yeah, it's a lot of discussion, and it's something that's a big fear for a lot of people in a lot of countries, even here in Canada. But I can't imagine even in Africa how this next level, and hopefully there's lessons from Ebola, as you mentioned, Sarah. That's something that we can take and hopefully kind of use that to help us through this time around in the pandemic. Another discussion that's really important is debt relief. And I know, Minister, you've been involved with a lot of initiatives. And this is a question from Amanda from Surrey, BC.
Hi, my name is Amanda and I live in British Columbia. And I read that until recently, several African countries have been making higher debt repayments than investing in their own healthcare systems. I'm wondering what you can tell us about how Canada and other countries are going to address this reality.
Great. Well, thank you, Amanda. This is a really important question. And one of the important reasons to provide some relief with regards to debt service payments is so that low-income countries can make those investments into their healthcare systems. And so Canada has really been at the forefront of advocating for this within the Paris Club, within the G7 and the G20. And both our Prime Minister and our Finance Minister have absolutely been advocating for this. And we've seen, I think it was a G20 Finance Minister statement that has come out in support of this, and also providing additional resources to the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund to provide more concessional loans to low-income countries at this time when they need it. And part of the other challenge, as Sarah and Peter have both raised, is the fact that there are lower government revenues right now as well. And so that's putting a serious strain on a number of lower income countries. And so Canada is very much, taking up this issue and leading and advocating on it.
Thank you. We have some questions, as I mentioned earlier. We would love for you to be part of this conversation. And during this Facebook Live, I'm sure we got lots of comments. And there was 2 questions that we kind of would like to acknowledge right now. I don't know what the questions are. Here we go. Our viewer question is, what kinds of opportunities do you see in emerging green economies following the pandemic? And I think I'll throw this to you, Minister.
Okay, great. So thank you, Mary Sue, for that question. One of the things that I've been thinking about a lot and that I think merits more conversation is how we build back better out of this pandemic. I try to be an eternal optimist and always see opportunity. And so this is a conversation that is being had. I'm co-convening with the United Kingdom a kind of informal dialogue with different development ministers around the world to talk precisely about this. And I'd say there's a lot of interest in how we have a green recovery coming out of this. But I think what's going to be really important is making sure that we include voices from the developing world to make sure that we're doing this together. And, as both Peter and Sarah have highlighted, I think what this pandemic shows is, we can't forget about the previous issues that we had prior to, March, when this became a global pandemic. It's just exacerbated big issues. And particularly when it comes to climate change, we have to recognize that there is a direct link between the health of people and the health of the planet. And so how do we build back better and create a more resilient planet is something that I'm really interested in and having a lot of conversations about these days.
Thank you so much. We're running out of time. It is wonderful to be with all of you, and this discussion, it's going to make a lot of people think about what's happening, and working together is so important. And we really are in it together. And thank you, Serah. Thank you to the Minister. Thank you for Peter for being here and giving your insight and telling your story and giving us information that we really need. And if you'd like to find out more, definitely go to one.org/oneworld to find out how we're fighting COVID-19. Thank you for joining us all, and have a great day, everybody. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.